Chapter 16, The Mother of All Battles. I can hear the grumbling now. Doggone it, it was going so well. Everyone was getting along with each other, more or less. Religious intolerance was a thing of the past. There were no wars going on. We were on our way to utopia. And now this. This is a massive military buildup discovered to be underway in Iran, called Magog in Ezekiel's prophecy, and its neighboring nations. Satellite imagery has caught the Iranians in a blatant breach of the European treaty, though their diplomats are vociferously denying any wrongdoing. Troop movements in Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Azerbaijan are said to be NATO-style war games designed to sharpen the skills of their internal peacekeeping forces. But it all looks like preparations for an invasion to everyone else in the world. The UN really doesn't know what to think. The leaders of the Western world had all been a bit surprised at the Ayatollah's sudden willingness to sign the Europe-sponsored peace initiative a year ago. The Iranian head of state, who was now being hailed in the Middle East as the Mahdi, whatever that is, had shocked the world by agreeing to the European leaders' terms early in the negotiations, and other Islamic states from Morocco to Pakistan had quickly fallen into line. It was almost too easy. It had seemed, as the expression goes, too good to be true. For years, the Muslim nations in the Middle East had been spending upwards of 20% of their gross domestic products on defense, 6 or 7 times the world average. That number had been reduced somewhat under the terms of the European Treaty, but now it has been discovered that since the treaty was signed, several nations, notably Russia and China, have been selling the Muslims huge amounts of war materiel under the guise of farm equipment and heavy construction machinery. Complicating things is the fact that Iran had joined the nuclear club several years before the Antichrist took the reins of power in Europe, but since the Ayatollah had not rattled his saber, or is that scimitar, since then, the Western nations had not pressed him about disarmament. In truth, they'd lost their taste for preventative warfare after watching the Americans win their fight in Iraq, only to lose thousands of their brave men one by one to Muslim terrorists, whom the press called insurgents, in the following frustrating years. The foregoing scenario is admittedly speculative, but it does fit the requirements of the prophetic scriptures, as well as this morning's newspaper. All we can really be sure of is what's written in the Bible.
In the latter days you, Gog, will come into the land of those brought back from the sword, and gathered from many people on the mountains of Yisrael, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you. Thus says Yahweh, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go against the land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates, to take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against a people gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. Ezekiel 38, 8-12.
The real mother of all battles is about to begin. The objective, to drive Israel into the sea, after robbing them blind. The plan will not go unnoticed, of course. Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Sheba and Dedan, as I mentioned previously, represent Saudi Arabia, who would prefer to sit this one out, and the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions no doubt indicate the financial and commercial interests of the Western world, who don't want the boat rocked unless they're the ones doing the rocking. We'll meet them again as we discuss the demise of commercial Babylon. Their fate is sealed, as is that of Sheba and Dedan, but we'll have to defer that story for later.
Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder? Therefore, Son of man, prophesy, and say to Gog, Thus says Yahweh, On that day when my people Yisrael dwell safely, will you not know it? Ezekiel 38:13-14.
Once again, we see that Muslim prophetic expectations will drive Gog's modus operandi. Sahih Muslim, in tradition number 6961, states that, quote, Allah's messenger, may peace be unto him, said, There would be a caliph in the last period of my ummah who would freely give handfuls of wealth to the people without counting it. I said to Abba Nadra and Abu Alala, Do you mean Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz? They said, No, he would be the Imam Mahdi. Unquote. Gog sees himself as a latter-day Muslim version of Robin Hood, buying support and popularity with every shekel he can steal. It will seem to him to be the perfect opportunity. The hated Jews now live in a land of unwalled villages. That is, though their defenses are pitifully anemic and their cities vulnerable to attack, they feel safe. And why is that? Because they have swallowed the Antichrist's promises of peace and protection, putting their own defense force, the IDF, under the suzerainty of the United Nations. The multi-million-dollar security fence they built during the first decade of the 21st century to keep the terrorists out has been pulled down in some places and leaks like a sieve everywhere else. The general scenario rings a loud bell. Back when Sennacherib the Assyrian was besieging Hezekiah's Jerusalem, his Rabshakeh, or chief negotiator / hoodlum, chided the Jews for relying on help from Egypt.
Broken reed on which a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt.
Or the Antichrist, as the case may be.
To all who trust in him. Isaiah 36:6.
True enough. But then the Rabshakeh told Hezekiah that he couldn't rely on Yahweh either. Big mistake. God replied through his prophet,
Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted up your eyes on high? The set-apart one of Yisrael. Isaiah 37:23.
And then he proceeded to kill the 185,000 Assyrian troops encamped outside the city walls. Gog's army will be big and scary too. Will Yahweh once again deliver his people? I wouldn't bet against it. Stay tuned. Gog, of course, never read Isaiah, nor does he know of Ezekiel, who reports,
Then you, Gog, will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You will come up against my people Yisrael like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me, when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. Thus says Yahweh, Are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants the prophets of Yisrael, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them? Ezekiel 38:15-17.
Here we are given a bit more information. First, as we saw in Jeremiah 1, Gog's attack will come from the north. Second, his army will be very large, numerous enough to cover the land like a cloud. And third, other prophets are said to have talked about him, though only Ezekiel calls him by name. As we shall see presently, the Bible has a great deal to say about Gog's war and the devastation it precipitates upon the earth. In the previous chapter, we saw that Daniel was given insight into the same campaign, but from the point of view of the Antichrist, not Gog. As we pick up the narrative, the Antichrist's UN troops are stationed in Israel, ostensibly to keep the peace. Daniel gives us a bird's-eye view of the entire Middle Eastern phase of the war.
At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, the Antichrist, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he, would be the Antichrist, shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, this would be Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, together comprising Jordan. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his feet. But news from the east and from the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury, to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious set-apart mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Daniel 11:40-45.
The king of the south and the king of the north attack Antichrist's UN forces in Israel in a coordinated pincer action. Is there an echo in here? That's exactly what Egypt, the king of the south, and Syria, the king of the north, did in both 1967 and 1973. Jordan, who shelled Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in 1967 and subsequently lost the West Bank to Israel, stayed out of the fray in 73. These hot-headed sons of Ishmael apparently think the third time's a charm. They throw most everything they've got at the under-defended Israelis. And yes, Syria does have a navy, mostly Russian-made Romeo submarines and missile frigates. It is at this point, speculation factor of 2, that the Antichrist personally sets up headquarters in Israel, directing the war from his new base of operations. By the description, I'd place his command center in or near Hebron, between the Mediterranean and Dead Seas. The word seas is plural in the Hebrew text, not far from Jerusalem. The Antichrist is able to repulse the attacks. Egypt is beaten back, and Gog's allies, Cush and Phut, that is, northern and eastern Africa beyond Egypt's borders, cower, at least temporarily, to his intimidation. As the European leader consolidates his grasp on everything of value in Israel and Egypt, the king of the north, Syria, is neutralized, losing territory by the mile. Jordan, who learned a painful lesson in 1967, refuses to put her toe in the waters of war, so with his hands full, the Antichrist leaves her alone, for now, trembling in anticipation of his next move. And where is Gog all this time? Antichrist's next move, as it turns out, is a reaction against news from the east and north. Who is east and north of Israel? Well, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran would all fit that description. But which of these nations has the potential at this point to alarm the Antichrist? Only Iran, Magog, the aggressive spiritual leader of the Muslim hordes, and quite possibly a nuclear power by this time, along with his northern allies, Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Gomer, and Togarmah, all of whom we identified in the previous chapter. What is the news of which Daniel speaks? It is nothing short of the total collapse of his vaunted peace plan. For the first time since the 7th century, the entire Muslim world is united in a common cause, unlike earlier Arab-Israeli wars in which the primary protagonists, Egypt and Syria, were left to extricate themselves from their own self-made predicament. Virtually the whole Islamic world is now poised and committed to finishing off the Jews in Israel once and for all. Egypt and Syria may have started it, but this time Gog has no intention of letting Israel finish it again.